Ralph de la Torre, former CEO of Steward Healthcare, resigned under a storm of controversy, culminating in contempt of Congress charges when he brazenly refused to appear before a congressional hearing. De la Torre has been accused of extracting millions of dollars, threatening the livelihoods of healthcare workers and health outcomes for patients. His fall from grace is not just an isolated case, but a cautionary tale of the larger, more sinister forces at play: private equity firms. De la Torre's leadership mirrored the aggressive, profit-driven tactics typical of these firms. But what are private equity firms, and why should every American understand how they are gutting our economy and hurting Americans, our livelihoods, our quality of life, and our environment? Private equity firms are shadowy financial players that specialize in buying struggling companies, often with borrowed money. They slash costs, cut corners, and milk profits before flipping or dismantling these companies entirely. Their goal? Not to build, but to extract, squeezing every drop of value, leaving broken businesses, shattered communities, and devastated industries in their wake. In essence, private equity acts as a financial predator, leeching off the lifeblood of industries that once served the public good. The methods are deceptively simple. Buy a company with a significant amount of debt, make it look more profitable in the short term by cutting investments, selling off assets, and reducing staff, then sell it off or take it public. It's legal, but many of these practices teeter on the edge of ethics and legality, like tax loopholes, regulatory capture, and secretive lobbying to deregulate industries. The private equity boom took root in the 1980s, during Reagan's presidency, the era of hostile takeovers, where tax cuts and deregulation policies opened the door for these firms to operate unchecked. The wealth inequality we see today is, in part, a direct result of the unchecked rise of these financial vultures, part of Reagan's real legacy on the destruction of the American way of life. What motivates the wealthy to invest in private equity? The rich invest in private equity firms because these firms offer opportunities for high returns that are often inaccessible through traditional investment vehicles like public stocks. Private equity firms typically acquire, restructure, and manage companies with the goal of increasing their value, which can lead to substantial profits when the firms sell these companies or take them public. For wealthy investors, private equity also offers diversification, tax advantages, and access to industries with high growth potential. Additionally, private equity investments are less regulated, allowing for more flexible and aggressive strategies to maximize financial gains. The promise of staggering returns with little oversight. For the ultra-wealthy, these firms offer a way to protect and grow their wealth while skirting around the rules and responsibilities that come with traditional business investments. They also feel a need to branch out, to invest their growing portfolios outside of the realms that may have been part of their inheritance. The nonprofit sector hasn't been spared either. Once sacred public goods like healthcare, housing, and education have increasingly been gobbled up by private equity. The number of once charitable institutions now owned by these firms has exploded, leaving essential services in jeopardy and the public in danger. This is where we begin our deep dive into the predatory practices of private equity firms, using Ralph de la Torre as the modern warning sign. In the following chapters, we'll examine how these firms have infiltrated nearly every facet of American life, driving up costs, reducing access, and hollowing out the industries we rely on. If de la Torre's downfall is a warning shot, the real devastation comes when we look at healthcare itself. In Part 2, we'll explore how private equity's iron grip on hospitals, medical practices, and health services is putting American lives at risk, literally. As you probably already know, the American healthcare system is already riddled with complexities and inequalities. But when private equity enters the scene, those problems are magnified. Over the past decade, private equity firms have steadily bought up hospitals, medical practices, nursing homes, and even emergency rooms, turning patient care into a profit-driven enterprise. The outcome? Closures, skyrocketing costs, and worsening health outcomes. When a private equity firm acquires a healthcare facility, the priority isn't patient care, it's the bottom line. Investment in medical equipment and staff training declines, and the focus shifts to slashing costs. Entire departments are often closed or understaffed, leaving communities, especially those in rural or underserved areas, without critical care. Imagine a local hospital shutting down its maternity ward or emergency room because it's not profitable enough. This is not hypothetical, it's happening. A 2021 study found that hospital closures are disproportionately higher in areas where private equity firms have taken over. Meanwhile, the communities left behind are forced to travel farther and pay more for less accessible care. Take the case of Hahnemann University Hospital in Philadelphia, purchased by a private equity firm in 2018. Despite serving a large, low-income population, it was closed just a year later when the firm found the land it was built on to be more valuable than the hospital itself. Thousands of patients were left without care, and medical students without a teaching hospital. What was once a public good was now an abandoned shell, sacrificed for financial gain. But it's not just about access. As private equity firms seek to maximize profit, they cut costs by reducing staffing and hiring less experienced personnel, putting patient safety at risk. Patients endure longer wait times, rushed procedures, and higher readmission rates as a result. It's a vicious cycle where the drive for profit erodes the very core of medical care healing. In addition, private equity's hold on healthcare has made it more expensive for everyday Americans. With private equity behind the wheel, hospitals hike up prices for procedures, consultations, and prescriptions to meet financial targets. A broken arm? That'll be thousands of dollars more than before. Routine surgery? Good luck avoiding the unexpected costs buried in your medical bill. In this high-stakes game of profits over people, patients, and workers are the losers. Healthcare, once considered a basic human right, is now a luxury many can no longer afford. The entire system is crumbling under the weight of financial exploitation. And while private equity firms walk away with enormous profits, the rest of us are left to pick up the pieces. The damage doesn't end with hospitals. In Part 3, we'll zoom out to explore the private equity takeover of the broader medical industry, drug companies, nursing homes, and emergency services. When every aspect of care is commodified, what happens to the quality of that care? Spoiler, it's not good. Beyond hospitals and clinics, private equity has sunk its claws into every corner of the medical industry, from nursing homes to pharmaceuticals. These firms are turning essential health services into commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited, often with disastrous consequences for patients, families, and caregivers alike. The business of medicine, it seems, has become a mere extension of Wall Street's speculative playbook. Take the pharmaceutical industry, where private equity's influence has driven up drug prices and throttled innovation. When these firms acquire drug companies, they often target the supply of generic medications, the affordable alternatives to brand-name drugs. By controlling supply and distribution, they've created artificial shortages and skyrocketing costs. Insulin, an essential medication for millions of Americans with diabetes, has seen staggering price increases, leaving patients to ration doses or skip them altogether. It's not about the cost of production, it's about manipulating the market for profit. And for patients, the consequences can be life-threatening. In nursing homes, private equity's footprint is equally damaging. When these firms take over long-term care facilities, their focus on profit margins leads to chronic understaffing, poor conditions, and neglect. Vulnerable elderly residents are treated as mere entries on a spreadsheet. Each body in a bed is a dollar sign. A recent study found that nursing homes owned by private equity had higher mortality rates and worse care quality than nonprofit or public counterparts. When corners are cut to save costs, it's the residents who suffer, often in silence, such as my mom, who received terrible care at one such facility in Washington, Pennsylvania, before she died from pneumonia that she got there before they discharged her while she was still sick. Another notorious example is the acquisition of Manor Care, a chain of nursing homes by the Carlyle Group. After being taken over, the chain saw severe cuts to staffing and maintenance, which led to unsafe conditions and inadequate care. Manor Care eventually declared bankruptcy, but not before hundreds of its elderly residents experienced neglect, abuse, and unnecessary deaths. Yet, the private equity firm that owned Manor Care walked away from the wreckage with billions in profit. Emergency services have also become prey to private equity. Private equity-owned ambulance companies, for instance, have been criticized for jacking up prices and putting patients in financial peril. An ambulance ride, which could once be considered a reliable, life-saving service, is now another point of financial exploitation. Patients are left with staggering bills, sometimes in the tens of thousands, after an emergency trip to the hospital. This commodification of every aspect of care strips away the human element that once defined medicine. What was once about healing and care is now about squeezing profits from suffering. Doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and care workers are forced into moral quandaries, having to choose between their oath to help patients and the financial directives imposed by corporate masters. It's a system on the brink of collapse, where the richest profit while the sickest suffer. As private equity destroys the healthcare landscape, it's also gutting one of the most fundamental rights in America: housing. In Part 4, we'll examine how private equity firms are turning homes into speculative assets, driving up rents, displacing families, and turning the dream of homeownership into a nightmare. For generations, owning a home has been the quintessential American dream, a symbol of stability, success, and security. But as private equity firms have moved into the housing market, that dream is rapidly slipping away for millions. These firms are buying up single-family homes, apartment complexes, and even entire neighborhoods, transforming housing into a speculative asset and driving up costs for everyone else. The consequences are devastating: skyrocketing rents, unaffordable home prices, and mass displacement. Private equity's entry into the housing market has turned homes, once considered places of personal and familial growth, into commodities to be flipped, rented, or sold at the highest possible profit. When a private equity firm buys a property, the focus shifts from providing livable spaces to maximizing rental income and property values. Renovations are often superficial, designed to make properties appear more valuable while ignoring long-term repairs or tenant needs. As a result, properties are flipped quickly, sold for a massive profit, and then the cycle continues, driving prices higher and higher. One of the most notorious examples is the Blackstone Group, the largest private equity firm in the world. Following the 2008 financial crisis, Blackstone bought up foreclosed homes at rock-bottom prices, turning them into rental properties. By 2020, they owned more than 80,000 single-family homes, charging above-market rent while providing minimal upkeep, further exacerbating the housing crisis in America. Their business model, known as rent extraction, has been accused of squeezing tenants dry, pushing rents ever higher while avoiding necessary repairs. A roof over your head is no longer guaranteed, but rather a luxury dictated by Wall Street's insatiable greed. This corporate takeover has led to a housing crisis that affects not only renters, but also aspiring homeowners. The increased demand for homes from these deep-pocketed firms makes it nearly impossible for the average American family to compete. First-time buyers are outbid by all-cash offers from private equity firms, pushing them out of the market entirely. The result? A nation of renters, trapped in a cycle of rising rents and declining opportunities for home ownership. But the damage doesn't stop there. As private equity firms gain control over more housing stock, they limit supply, inflating housing costs in the process. This has led to the gentrification of entire neighborhoods, displacing longtime residents who can no longer afford to live in their own communities. Cities across America, from New York to Los Angeles, have seen a surge in evictions and homelessness as rents outpace incomes and affordable housing options disappear. Some of these firms aren't even based in America. The housing crisis, exacerbated by private equity, isn't just an economic issue, it's a human one. When housing becomes unaffordable, families are torn apart, social mobility is stifled, and the gap between the rich and poor widens even further. It's yet another example of how private equity firms, driven by profit at all costs, are eroding the very foundations of American society. As we move from housing to infrastructure, the next chapter takes us into the construction and engineering sectors. Private equity is not just inflating costs in housing, but also undermining the industries that build America's future. In Part 5, we'll examine how private equity's profit-first approach is compromising safety, delaying projects, and making basic infrastructure a luxury few can afford. Private equity's insidious influence extends deep into America's construction and engineering sectors, industries responsible for building the very infrastructure that keeps society functioning. Roads, bridges, schools, and public buildings, each a vital piece of the American landscape, are increasingly controlled by firms that care more about quick profits than long-term safety and sustainability. The result? Staffing shortages, delayed projects, and ballooning costs that leave the public to pay the price, both financially and in terms of safety. When private equity firms enter the construction or engineering space, their goal isn't to build better, more durable infrastructure. It's to extract as much profit as quickly as possible. The first step? Cutting corners. By slashing budgets, downsizing the workforce, and using lower quality materials, these firms aim to reduce costs to the bone, often at the expense of safety and durability. Projects that once took time and care to complete are rushed through, sacrificing the integrity of the very structures they're building. One glaring example is the acquisition of several construction firms by private equity giant Apollo Global Management. Apollo's takeovers resulted in an aggressive focus on cost-cutting, leading to projects delayed for years, and shoddy, dangerous construction practices. In one case, a large public school renovation was delayed multiple times due to budget constraints imposed by Apollo's new management, leaving students and teachers in unsafe makeshift buildings. These delays and cost overruns aren't isolated incidents. The same pattern repeats across America. Private equity-backed construction firms promise low bids to win government contracts, only to delay projects and drive up costs once they've secured the deal. The original savings offered by these firms are often illusory, as taxpayers are left footing the bill for endless delays and rework caused by substandard labor and materials. This approach also affects worker safety. Private equity-backed firms frequently reduce worker protections, safety training, and benefits to boost profit margins, resulting in increased workplace accidents and fatalities. The construction industry is already dangerous, but under private equity control, it becomes even more perilous. Cutting back on safety standards or using less experienced workers hired on the cheap leads to preventable injuries, leaving workers vulnerable while executives count their earnings. The collapse of American infrastructure is both a literal and metaphorical consequence of private equity's influence. Bridges that should last for decades begin to show signs of wear and tear in just a few years. Public buildings require constant maintenance because they weren't built to last. And the public suffers not just from inconvenience, but from genuine risks to their safety. Meanwhile, these private equity firms walk away with massive profits, having gutted the industries that should be constructing the backbone of our nation. While the country needs to rebuild and modernize its infrastructure, private equity's grip on the construction and engineering sectors only ensures that we'll pay more for less, jeopardizing the future of American development. Infrastructure might be crumbling, but the roads and railways that move America's people and goods are under equal threat. In Part 6, we'll explore how private equity's control of transportation and logistics companies is not only driving up costs, but also crippling efficiency. The next chapter exposes how America's supply chains and transportation networks are being eroded by private equity's relentless pursuit of profit. Private equity's chokehold on America's transportation and logistics sectors is crippling the very arteries that keep the nation's economy flowing. From trucking companies and railroads to shipping ports and warehouses, these critical industries are being gutted by private equity firms that prioritize short-term profits over long-term functionality. The result? Supply chain disruptions, higher costs for consumers, and a crumbling transportation infrastructure that threatens to bring America's economy to a grinding halt. When private equity firms acquire transportation companies, their first move is often to cut costs in ways that directly harm efficiency and safety. Trucking companies, for example, are forced to downsize their fleets, lay off experienced drivers, and push remaining employees to the brink with longer hours and fewer safety measures. The effects ripple across the country: delayed shipments, increased freight costs, and most concerning, higher rates of accidents and fatalities on the road. One high-profile example is the acquisition of Celadon, one of the largest trucking companies in the United States, by private equity investors. What followed was a disastrous collapse. Under private equity control, the company engaged in accounting fraud to cover up mounting financial problems, eventually filing for bankruptcy in 2019. The result? Thousands of truck drivers were left stranded mid-route. Goods went undelivered, and the company's collapse sent shockwaves through an already strained supply chain. Railroads, a backbone of America's freight system, have also fallen prey to private equity. Companies like CSX and Norfolk Southern, once robust carriers of goods across the country, have been subjected to precision-scheduled railroading, a private equity-backed cost-cutting strategy designed to reduce the number of trains and workers needed. This might sound efficient, but it has led to severe delays, fewer workers to maintain safety standards, and backlogs at key points in the supply chain. The short-term gains for investors come at the expense of long-term viability, as vital infrastructure is allowed to degrade. Reasons like these can lead to issues like Norfolk Southern's 2023 spill in East Palestine, Ohio. From trains to school buses, private equity firms are gobbling up as much of America as they can. This same pattern repeats in shipping ports and warehouses, where private equity's focus on maximizing profits often leads to staffing cuts and a reliance on lower-wage, temporary workers. The impact on America's ports, already strained by global supply chain issues, has been severe. Delays in processing shipments, breakdowns in communication, and overworked staff mean that goods take longer to reach their destination, if they make it at all. The everyday consumer feels the pinch as prices rise due to transportation bottlenecks and shortages. The logistics industry, which was once driven by efficiency and precision, is now driven by the relentless need for quarterly returns. Shipping delays, missed deadlines, and rising costs are just some of the symptoms of this disease. As private equity firms suck profits from these industries, America's supply chains are left fragile and vulnerable to further collapse. This takeover of transportation networks is more than just an inconvenience. It's a systemic threat to the economy. When goods can't move efficiently, businesses across the country suffer, and consumers end up paying more for everyday necessities. Transportation and logistics, once the lifeblood of a robust economy, are being bled dry by private equity firms. With supply chains unraveling, we next turn to technology, software, and data industries where private equity is increasingly gaining control. In Part 7, we'll investigate how these firms are compromising innovation and data security in their relentless pursuit of profit, leaving America vulnerable in the digital age. In the fast-evolving world of technology, private equity firms have found their latest gold mine, but their involvement is eroding innovation, weakening data security, and compromising the digital tools that power modern life. Whether it's acquiring software companies, data storage providers, or cybersecurity firms, private equity's incursion into tech threatens to undermine the very industries that are critical to America's future. The result? Skyrocketing prices, stagnant innovation, and the increased vulnerability of sensitive information. Private equity's strategy in the tech sector mirrors the playbook used in other industries: acquire companies, slash costs, and raise prices, all while cutting back on the very investments that drive innovation. Once a private equity firm buys a software company, for example, it often reduces spending on research and development, leading to fewer updates, stagnation of technology, and a weakened product. Innovation grinds to a halt, not because the potential isn't there, but because short-term profits take precedence over long-term growth. A prime example is the acquisition of Symantec's cybersecurity division by Broadcom, a private equity-backed company. Once a leader in cybersecurity, Symantec saw massive layoffs and budget cuts following the acquisition, leaving customers with degraded security services and fewer resources to respond to cyber threats. In a world where cyber attacks are a constant and growing danger, cutting corners in cybersecurity is nothing short of reckless. Companies and individuals who rely on these services find themselves more exposed than ever before, all in the name of profit. The world of data, too, has been infiltrated by private equity. As data becomes the new currency, private equity firms are quick to acquire companies that control vast amounts of information, whether it's cloud storage, data analytics, or software as a service. But with this acquisition comes a troubling trend: the commodification of personal data. Data breaches are increasingly common as firms cut back on security measures while charging higher fees for services. For the average American, this means that personal information, credit card numbers, social security details, medical histories are more vulnerable to hackers, sold to the highest bidder, or compromised in a breach. Another troubling example comes from the acquisition of GoDaddy, a web hosting and domain registration service, by private equity. Following its takeover, the company saw increases in fees for basic services, such as domain renewals, without a corresponding improvement in the quality of its services. Small businesses and individual users were suddenly faced with higher costs for tools they had relied on for years. This is the private equity effect: higher costs, but no added value. Moreover, in the highly competitive and fast-paced tech industry, innovation is crucial. Yet private equity's model of stripping down companies and draining them for immediate gains starves the industry of the creativity and investment necessary to push the boundaries of what's possible. The long-term effect? A technological landscape where innovation slows, competitors are crushed or bought out, and consumers are left with fewer choices at higher prices. At the heart of these issues lies a fundamental problem. Private equity doesn't see technology as a tool for progress, but as a vehicle for profit. As a result, we risk entering a future where technological advancement slows to a crawl, and the digital landscape becomes less secure, less creative, and more dominated by a handful of profit-driven firms. As technology falters under private equity's control, the ripple effects reach far beyond the digital world. In Part 8, we'll dive into manufacturing and consumer products, where private equity's tactics are undermining quality and driving up prices, leaving American consumers to bear the burden of these profit-driven schemes. Stay tuned as we explore how even the products we use every day are not safe from the destructive force of private equity. Private equity's relentless pursuit of profit has also deeply infiltrated America's manufacturing and consumer product industries, where the consequences are felt in the form of inferior products, higher prices, shrinkflation, and the erosion of the country's industrial base. Once known for quality and durability, American-made goods are now being produced under conditions that prioritize investor returns over craftsmanship, safety, and value for the everyday consumer. This shift, orchestrated by private equity, is hollowing out industries that were once the backbone of the U.S. economy. When private equity firms acquire manufacturing companies, their first move is to cut costs, and these cuts often come at the expense of quality. Factories that once employed highly skilled workers and invested in top-notch machinery are now forced to rely on cheaper labor and substandard materials. These cost-saving measures may benefit the firm's bottom line, but they have devastating effects on the products being produced and the workers who make them. Take the infamous case of the Kraft-Heinz merger, driven by private equity-backed 3G Capital. The resulting cost-cutting frenzy led to a drastic reduction in spending on product development, maintenance, and worker safety. Beloved products saw their quality plummet, with reports of food contamination, spoilage, and recalls. By squeezing every dollar out of production, the firm sacrificed the trust consumers once had in these household names, leading to a public relations disaster and declining sales. Private equity's approach in the manufacturing sector often includes offshoring jobs to lower-cost countries, abandoning the domestic workforce and communities that once thrived on these industries. This deindustrialization of America is no accident. It's the direct result of private equity's global hunt for cheaper labor and higher margins. Factories close, workers are laid off, and entire towns that depended on manufacturing jobs are left in economic ruin. But it's not just about job loss. Private equity's influence is also felt at the checkout counter. With fewer competitors in the market, thanks to private equity's consolidation of brands and companies, consumers face higher prices for lower-quality goods. Products that were once built to last are now designed for obsolescence, forcing consumers to replace them more frequently. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a deliberate strategy to maximize profits by ensuring that customers return again and again to buy the same products over and over. Even the supply chains for everyday consumer goods have been strained under private equity control. Companies once built on reliable logistics are now driven by razor-thin margins, where delays, shortages, and price hikes are becoming the norm. In a bid to cut costs, private equity often reduces investment in critical supply chain infrastructure, leading to bottlenecks and inefficiencies that ultimately impact consumers. What once operated like a well-oiled machine is now a series of cracks and breakdowns, affecting everything from grocery store shelves to electronics. Workers, too, suffer under these profit-driven tactics. Factories are increasingly dangerous as firms cut back on safety measures and employee protections. In some cases, workers are forced to work longer hours in hazardous conditions, with fewer benefits and lower wages. While private equity firms celebrate record profits, it's the workers who pay the price, literally and figuratively. Private equity's grip on manufacturing and consumer products is more than a business strategy. It's a dismantling of the American industrial dream. A once thriving middle class that relied on these jobs is being squeezed out, replaced by a global race to the bottom in terms of wages, safety, and quality. Meanwhile, consumers face inflated prices and declining product standards, all while private equity firms reap enormous profits from the chaos they create. As private equity wreaks havoc on manufacturing, their influence extends even deeper into another critical sector: energy. In Part 9, we'll expose how private equity is driving up energy costs, exploiting environmental loopholes, and fueling the climate crisis. Stay tuned as we dig into how the oil and gas industries are being pillaged for profit at the expense of both people and the planet. Private equity's reach has extended into the oil and gas industry, where its relentless pursuit of short-term profits is not only driving up energy costs, but also accelerating environmental destruction. As these firms buy up oil and gas companies, they operate with little regard for the long-term consequences, exploiting resources and degrading the environment while leaving communities and the planet to deal with the fallout. The results? Soaring energy prices, increased pollution, and a significant contribution to the climate crisis. The oil and gas industry, once dominated by major energy corporations, is now increasingly controlled by private equity firms. These firms acquire smaller energy companies or distressed assets, often in the wake of price crashes or economic downturns. Once in control, they employ aggressive cost-cutting strategies, such as laying off workers, reducing safety standards, and skimping on environmental protections. All of this is done to maximize profits while extracting as much oil and gas as quickly as possible, with little concern for the long-term sustainability of these operations. A notable example of this strategy can be seen with the Carlyle Group, one of the largest private equity firms, which acquired several oil and gas companies over the past decade. These firms have not only accelerated extraction, but also sidestepped environmental regulations, lobbying to delay climate reforms that could threaten their profits. Carlyle's operations in Texas, for instance, have been linked to increased methane emissions, a greenhouse gas significantly more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of its climate warming effects. But it's not just environmental degradation that private equity firms leave in their wake. Energy prices are increasingly volatile, driven by the speculative nature of these firms' business models. By buying and flipping oil and gas companies, private equity firms have contributed to market instability, causing price spikes that affect everyday Americans. When a firm cuts back on investment in infrastructure or divests from a company after squeezing out every dollar, it leaves behind a weakened company incapable of handling demand fluctuations or maintaining steady supply chains. The result? Consumers see rising energy bills, while private equity firms walk away with massive returns. One of the most troubling aspects of private equity's involvement in oil and gas is their complete disregard for environmental responsibility. Private equity-backed companies often operate in regions with weaker regulatory oversight, like the Permian Basin in Texas, where environmental protections are lax. These firms are notorious for flouting safety regulations, neglecting to address spills, and contributing to the contamination of local water supplies. For communities living near these operations, the effects are devastating polluted air, poisoned water, and health problems that disproportionately affect low-income and marginalized populations. Despite growing global awareness of the climate crisis, private equity's grip on the fossil fuel industry is tightening. Instead of investing in renewable energy or helping to transition the world to a sustainable future, these firms double down on dirty energy, squeezing out as much profit as possible before the world shifts away from fossil fuels. The boom and bust cycle of the oil industry is exacerbated by private equity's short-term focus, which prioritizes quarterly returns over the urgent need to transition to clean energy. By exploiting regulatory loopholes and political connections, private equity firms have shielded themselves from the full brunt of climate-related financial risk. However, the costs are externalized onto the public and future generations. As these firms rake in profits, the planet continues to warm, and the window for meaningful climate action grows smaller. As private equity profits from polluting the planet, we've explored how its influence taints nearly every critical industry in America. But what does this all mean for the future of the country? In our final chapter, Part X, we'll bring together everything we've uncovered to explain how private equity is fueling inequality and threatening the future of democracy itself. Stay with us as we conclude this exposé and reveal how wealth concentration, driven by these firms, is the root cause of so many of America's current crises. As we conclude this exposé, it becomes clear that private equity firms, whether domestic or foreign, are not just financial predators targeting individual industries. They are a systemic force, driving inequality, climate change, destabilizing critical institutions, and threatening the very future of American democracy. Through their insidious tactics, these firms have infiltrated nearly every corner of American life, from healthcare and housing to technology, manufacturing, and even the oil and gas sector. Each chapter of this story has illustrated some of the real-world consequences of private equity's relentless pursuit of profit. Rising costs, reduced access, lower quality, and increasing danger to ordinary Americans. But beyond the immediate harm to consumers, workers, and the environment lies a deeper threat: the concentration of wealth and power. Private equity's meteoric rise is a direct consequence of policies that have allowed the wealthiest Americans to manipulate the financial system for their benefit. From the deregulation of markets that started in the Reagan era to the continuing tax breaks for the rich, we've watched as wealth has flowed upward into the hands of a few, while the middle class and working class struggle under the weight of growing inequality. Private equity represents the apex of this problem. By gutting companies, driving up costs, and eliminating competition, these firms funnel immense wealth into the hands of a select few investors. This wealth, in turn, grants them outsized political influence, allowing them to further shape policies in their favor. They lobby against regulations that could rein them in, dodge taxes that would otherwise fund public services, and use their financial might to ensure that any attempts at reform are watered down or blocked altogether. This concentration of wealth and power not only weakens the economy, but erodes democracy itself. As private equity firms accumulate more power, the voice of the average American grows weaker. Communities that depend on the services and industries taken over by these firms find themselves at the mercy of executives who have no stake in their well-being. Workers are left with few protections, consumers with fewer options, and citizens with less influence over the policies that shape their lives. As wealth inequality deepens, so too does social unrest. The growing divide between the ultra-wealthy and everyone else has led to a sense of disenfranchisement, as more Americans feel that the system is rigged against them. This has bred political polarization, instability, and a loss of faith in the institutions that are supposed to serve the public good. When private equity is allowed to run rampant, it feeds into this broader trend of democratic decay, where the economy and government no longer work for the majority, but for an elite minority. In this context, the story of private equity is not just a tale of financial greed, but a key part of the larger story of America's struggle with wealth inequality and its consequences. This is why the exposé you've just watched is more than a deep dive into one industry. It's a call to action. If we are to reverse the tide of inequality and restore balance to our democracy, we must start by addressing the outsized influence of private equity firms and the policies that enable them. When considering how the 2024 candidates may address the issue of private equity, the choice between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is stark. Donald Trump's policies historically favored deregulation and tax cuts for the wealthy, which allowed private equity firms to flourish unchecked. During his administration, private equity expanded its reach across various sectors, aided by relaxed regulations and a tax regime that catered to the ultra-wealthy. Trump's approach has largely been to prioritize corporate profits over consumer protections and worker rights, which aligns with the interests of private equity firms. In contrast, Kamala Harris has pushed for reforms that could directly address the abuses of private equity. Harris has consistently supported antitrust actions aimed at breaking up monopolistic entities and advocated for policies that strengthen workers' rights and consumer protections and necessary regulation. Although she has not introduced specific legislation targeting private equity firms, her broader policy agenda is aligned with curbing corporate power, increasing transparency, raising taxes on the rich, and promoting economic equality. She has voiced support for reforms that would limit the unchecked influence of these firms on essential industries like healthcare and housing, making her a more promising candidate for those concerned about the rise of private equity. When evaluating which candidate would better serve the interests of working Americans in the fight against private equity, Kamala Harris is the stronger advocate for reforms that protect essential industries, increase transparency, and reduce the exploitative practices of financial predators. Her policies are more in line with fostering a fairer economy and ensuring that corporate greed does not continue to undermine the stability and well-being of everyday Americans. Thank you for watching. This was part 3 of a series on the concentration of wealth. If you enjoyed this video, please check out Americans Don't Like to Talk About Money, which introduces the topic of financial literacy, and part 2, Flipping the Bill, How the Rich Screw You. My channel, Renaissance Spirit, is dedicated to the pursuit of a just, equitable, and humanitarian world. And this discussion of private equity is at the heart of that mission. Through history, politics, religion, culture, and society, we explore the forces shaping our world and how we can work together to forge a better future. From the ancient lessons of Rome to the challenges of the modern age, Renaissance Spirit is about more than just learning. It's about understanding how we can be part of the solution. As we've seen, the unchecked power of private equity firms is a symptom of a broader problem: the growing concentration of wealth and the erosion of democratic institutions. It's a challenge that threatens the very foundation of our society. But it's also a challenge that we, as citizens and stewards of the future, can rise to meet. The Renaissance was a time of enlightenment, a rebirth of knowledge and humanism that led to profound changes in the world. It's time for a new Renaissance, one that is driven by a commitment to equality, justice, and the well-being of all people, not just the wealthy few. Living the Renaissance spirit means engaging with these issues, learning from history, and taking action to shape the future. Please subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video to continue this journey with me as we explore more topics that illuminate the paths to a more just and humane world. Take the quiz to see if you embody the Renaissance spirit, a spirit that looks to the past, engages with the present, and envisions a brighter future. Together, let's build a future that honors the best of what humanity can achieve. A future free from the fear of inequality, environmental collapse, and the erosion of democracy. Live the Renaissance spirit. History is not dead, nor is it distant. It's a living dialogue, one that we all have the power to influence. Will we learn from it or repeat its mistakes? Find out what you can do to take back your country and your life in our other videos. Peace.